This is my true story. I was a father who worked every single day of his life for his only son. I gave him my savings, my time, and the house I built with my own two hands. When I fell sick, I thought he would finally care for me the way I once cared for him. But I was wrong. 3 days after my surgery, when I could barely walk, he threw me out of my own home like I was nothing. He thought I was weak. But what I did next took everything from him. Before I continue, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. And subscribe so more people hear my story. I worked my whole life to build something my son could stand on. When he was born, I promised myself he would never live the kind of life I had. One of struggle and scraped meals, one of debts and sleepless nights. I started with nothing, just a toolbox, an old bicycle, and the will to make something out of dust. I worked construction by day and repaired machines by night. Every paycheck I earned went into his future, not into comfort, not into pleasure, but into something I thought would last: his education, his business, his dreams. When he turned 18, I sold half my land to pay for his college fees. I remember the day I handed over the papers, my hands shaking, my heart full of pride. I told him, "This will be your foundation." He hugged me then, said he'd make me proud. I believed him. Every letter he sent from college was full of big plans: the company he'd build, the people he'd help, the future he'd give back to me. I kept every one of those letters in a wooden box beside my bed, thinking that one day, when I was old and weak, he'd sit by me and read them again. When he graduated, I mortgaged what was left of my property so he could start his business. He called it the Legacy Firm, said it was a tribute to everything I'd done for him. I smiled at the name. I spent long nights reviewing his first contracts, helping him find clients, using every connection I had left from my working years to help him grow. Slowly, he did. Within 5 years, he went from small offices to glass buildings, from second-hand furniture to imported desks, from struggling for one customer to turning others away. People in town began to speak his name with respect, the young businessman with a golden touch. And every time I heard it, my chest swelled with pride. I moved in with him after my wife passed. The house was large, 2 floors, wide yard, modern furniture. I used to sweep the porch early in the mornings and cook breakfast for him and his wife before they woke. I wanted to feel useful. He would smile at first, thank me, even sit with me sometimes. But as years passed, his tone changed. His eyes shifted. The warmth in his voice faded, replaced by something sharper, colder. Whenever his friends visited, he'd introduce me like a footnote. "That's my dad. He helped me when I was starting out." They'd nod politely, then go back to talking business. I'd smile, pretending not to notice. But inside, something began to ache. I watched him grow, not just in success, but in pride. His office became his temple. His money became his mirror. He stopped calling me dad and started calling me old man. I told myself it was just stress, that business changed people. But deep down, I knew something sacred had begun to rot. He had forgotten the years I stood in the rain fixing machines just to buy him books. He had forgotten the nights I came home covered in dust, only to see him sleeping peacefully under a roof I built. When his business hit its highest peak, he bought a luxury car. I remember standing in the driveway, watching him drive in with that machine gleaming like it belonged to someone else. He walked out, handed me the keys and said, "What do you think, old man?" I smiled and said, "It's beautiful." But what I wanted to say was, "So were you once." He began traveling more, eating out more, talking less. I became a ghost in his house, silent, invisible, tolerated. I didn't complain. I thought time would bring him back to his senses. I thought that one day, when life slowed him down, he'd remember who stood behind his success. But instead, when life slowed me down, when age and sickness finally caught up, he didn't reach out a hand. He turned away. I had spent my youth building his strength, and now he used it to erase mine. I had given him everything, my savings, my name, my home, believing that blood would mean loyalty. But I was wrong. In giving him everything, I had left myself with nothing. The day of my surgery felt like the longest day of my life. The doctor said my heart needed repair. Years of hard labor, stress, and sleepless nights had taken their toll. I wasn't scared of dying. I was scared of leaving without saying everything I still wanted to tell my son. Before they rolled me into the operating room, he stood beside my hospital bed, checking his phone. I tried to smile at him, to ease his nerves. "Don't worry," I whispered, my voice weak. "It's just a small procedure." He nodded, barely looking up, and said something about a meeting he couldn't miss. I watched him walk away before the anesthesia took me under. The last thing I saw was the ceiling light fading into white. When I woke up, there was a heavy silence. The nurse smiled and said, "The surgery went well." My chest hurt, but I was alive. I looked around, expecting to see him, my son, my blood, my only family. The chair next to my bed was empty. Hours passed. I waited, thinking maybe he was stuck in traffic or busy managing something important. But deep down, a small voice whispered the truth I didn't want to hear. He just didn't come. 2 days later, he appeared. He wasn't smiling. He didn't ask how I felt. He looked tired, impatient, like being there was an obligation. He said the hospital bills were high, that I should recover fast so I could move back home. I nodded, saying little. I didn't want to fight. I just wanted to rest, to heal, to feel like I still had a place to belong when I got out of that bed. After a week, they discharged me. My chest was wrapped in bandages, my steps slow and shaky. The nurse helped me to the car, and I thought of all the years I had carried him in my arms. Now, I needed help to walk 10 steps. When we reached the house, his wife opened the door, her eyes cold. No welcome, no warmth, just silence. She walked past me, whispering something I couldn't hear. My son avoided my eyes. I sat down carefully in the chair by the window, the same chair I had sat in every morning for years. The room looked different. My tools were gone from the corner. My photographs had been taken off the shelf. It didn't feel like my home anymore. The next morning, I asked if he could help me to the bathroom, my body still too weak to move freely. He sighed loudly, as if my words were an inconvenience. "Dad," he said, rubbing his forehead, "you need to get stronger. I can't keep doing this." I looked at him, unsure if I'd heard correctly. He was serious. He said he couldn't take care of me anymore, that I was making things difficult for him and his wife. I sat there, my chest tight, not from surgery, but from heartbreak. By evening, he had made up his mind. He packed my clothes in a small bag, my medicines in a box, and said he'd found a place where I could stay for a while. I didn't understand at first. Then I saw the name on the paper, a care center. My throat went dry. I had spent my life working so that he would never feel abandoned, and now he was sending me away like an unwanted guest. He drove me there himself. The silence in the car was heavy. I looked out the window at the world passing by. The streets I had once walked with him when he was small, the corner shop where we used to buy ice cream, the park where he learned to ride a bike. Memories everywhere, but no warmth left in them. When we arrived, he opened the door and handed me my bag. "It's just for a few days," he said without meeting my eyes. Then he turned back toward the car and drove off before I could say anything. I watched the taillights disappear into the distance until they were gone. My chest ached. I stood there alone, under a flickering streetlight, holding the bag that contained the last remains of my life. The nurse at the care center helped me inside, showing me to a narrow bed beside a window that faced a brick wall. The air smelled like medicine and dust. I sat down slowly, staring at the door that had just closed. Somewhere deep inside, something inside me broke quietly, but not completely. I had lost my place in his home, but I hadn't yet lost my power to remind him what it feels like to lose everything. The care center was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that feels heavy on the chest. The first night, I lay on the narrow bed, staring at the pale ceiling. The air smelled of bleach and sadness. In the room next to mine, an old man coughed through the night, calling for a nurse who never came. Somewhere down the hall, a clock ticked so slowly it felt like time itself had stopped. I turned my face to the wall and closed my eyes, But sleep never came. All I could see in my mind was my son's face, the same face I had once kissed goodnight, now hardened with coldness and pride. He had told me it was temporary. Just for a few days, he said. He had even smiled when he dropped me off, as though his words could disguise the truth written in his eyes. I wasn't coming back. I knew it. He knew it. His wife knew it. And that was the part that broke me most. Not the words, not the act, but the calmness with which they did it. Like it was easy. Like I had been waiting my whole life for that moment to come. The bed creaked when I moved, the blanket thin and rough against my skin. I stared at the ceiling fan turning slowly, each rotation cutting through my thoughts like a blade. I remembered the time when that boy was in the hospital with a broken arm. I didn't leave his side for a second. I sat there feeding him soup, sleeping on the floor beside his bed, praying that his pain would leave his body and enter mine instead. I remembered when he first opened his small business, and I mortgaged my land so he could have enough to hire his first employees. I remembered the look on his face when he succeeded, proud, confident, grateful. I thought that pride would grow into kindness. Instead, it grew into cruelty. The nurses came and went without speaking much. They placed pills on my table and left water beside them. I asked one if I could call home. She nodded, handed me the old phone from the counter. My hand shook as I dialed his number. It rang once, twice, 3 times, then went to voicemail. I tried again. The same. I sat there, the phone pressed against my ear, listening to the empty tone echo like laughter in my chest. When I put it down, I stared at my reflection in the small window, an old man who had given his everything to a son who couldn't spare a few minutes of love. Later that afternoon, I looked out the window. The rain had started again. Soft, steady, endless. Drops slid down the glass like tears I was too tired to cry. I saw other families visiting their parents, bringing flowers, hugs, food. My room stayed quiet. No knock, no footsteps, no one came. I thought maybe he'd show up after work, maybe he'd feel guilty once the house felt too empty. But he didn't. The only sound that filled the room was the beating of my own heart, weak but stubborn. 3 days passed like one long, gray stretch of time. No calls, no visits, not even a message. Every morning, I woke to the sound of carts moving down the hall. Food trays, medicine, silence. I ate little. My body was healing, but my heart wasn't. The same hands that once built his future now trembled holding a spoon. The same man who once carried him to school now had no one to hold on to. I thought I'd known pain in life, losing my wife, working myself to exhaustion, watching friends pass away. But nothing compared to this. Being forgotten by the person you loved most. That third night, I stopped trying to sleep. I sat upright in bed, staring at the wall, and whispered to myself the truth I'd been avoiding. He doesn't want me anymore. The words felt like poison, but they freed something inside me. If he didn't want me, then he didn't deserve what I had given him. I reached for my bag beside the bed. Inside, wrapped in old cloth, were the property papers, half of what he thought was already his. He never cared to check. He thought I had given him everything, but I had held back the most important part. My name still existed on those deeds, those shares, those guarantees. I smiled faintly for the first time in days. He thought he had ended my story, but he had only given me a reason to write the last chapter myself. That night, I decided, I wouldn't die broken. I wouldn't die forgotten. I would remind him, not with anger, not with shouting, but with silence and consequence. The same silence he gave me. That night stretched longer than any I had lived before. The rain outside whispered against the windows like an old song I used to hum when my son was small. The walls of the care center creaked, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant, and the clock ticked in the dark like a slow heartbeat, reminding me I was still alive. I couldn't close my eyes. I wasn't tired, just hollow. My body ached from the surgery, but the real pain lived deeper, where no medicine could reach. I thought about the years I had spent building a world for him, a world that now belonged to someone else entirely. My home, my business, my blood. Everything had his name on it. everything except the last part I had kept hidden. I stared at the folder beside my bed, the same folder that held my final piece of dignity. The papers were old, corners frayed, the ink fading, but my name was still clear, written in careful strokes. Owner and guarantor. The business account, the land title, and a small joint deposit that I had kept secret for emergencies. He never knew. I told him once that everything was his, and he believed it because that's what greed does. It listens only when it benefits. I used to keep those papers safe for him. Now, I realized, they were my only weapon left. The nurse came by to check my pulse. She asked softly if I needed anything. I shook my head. How do you tell someone you need your heart to forget your own child? When she left, I sat up and opened the drawer by my bed. Inside was the small phone the center gave residents for emergency calls. My hands shook as I dialed a number I hadn't used in years. My old lawyer, Mr. Raymond. He had been there since the beginning, the man who handled every paper I signed when I built my first workshop. The line rang twice before his familiar voice answered, cautious and kind. I told him who I was, and for a moment he went quiet, maybe because my voice sounded weaker than he remembered. Then I said, I need you to pull every file under my name. Every property, every share, every account. He hesitated. Are you sure, sir? He asked. Your son's business operates under... I stopped him gently. I know what it operates under. I also know who built it. For the first time in days, I felt steady. Calm. Cold in a way that wasn't cruel, but necessary. He promised to meet me the next morning, to bring everything for signature. I thanked him and placed the phone down slowly. My heart was beating faster, not from fear, but from something I hadn't felt in years. Control. As the hours passed, I thought about all the nights I had stayed awake for my son, waiting for him to come home from late shifts, waiting for his college acceptance letter, waiting to hear his car pull into the driveway so I knew he was safe. Now I was staying awake for a different reason, to take back the years he had stolen from me. Not with hate, but with precision. He had thrown me out thinking I was weak, but he forgot that age doesn't erase memory, it sharpens it. At around 3 a.m., I stood and walked slowly to the window. My stitches pulled slightly, but I didn't care. Outside, the rain had stopped. The world was quiet, still. A single street light flickered near the corner of the road, painting the wet pavement in yellow streaks. I pressed my hand against the cold glass and whispered, "You'll learn, son." It wasn't a curse, it was a promise. A father's final lesson, the kind that isn't taught with words, but with loss. I returned to bed but didn't lie down. I sat upright, the folder resting in my lap. The nurse peeked in once, saw me awake, and nodded softly without saying a word. She must have known this wasn't a night for sleeping. Some nights are for remembering who you are. Some nights are for reclaiming everything you gave away. When dawn began to break, the light creeping through the blinds felt different. Stronger, almost golden. I took it as a sign. My pain hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something purer. Purpose. That long night ended with a quiet decision. The man my son had thrown away would rise again. And when he did, the world that boy built on borrowed ground would crumble. Not by anger, not by revenge, but by justice, written in ink. The sun had barely risen when I reached for the phone again. My hands trembled as I dialed Mr. Raymond's number, the lawyer who had stood beside me through every stage of my life, from buying my first piece of land to helping my son start his business. The moment he answered, I could hear surprise in his voice. "Sir, you're calling early," he said. I told him I hadn't slept. I didn't tell him why. I simply said, "It's time." He paused, maybe understanding more than I said. Then he replied softly, "I'll prepare everything." He arrived at the care center 2 hours later. I met him in the small garden behind the building, where the air was cool and the smell of damp grass carried through the wind. He looked older, silver hair, slower steps, but his eyes were still sharp. He carried a leather briefcase, worn but clean. When he opened it, the sound of the latch clicked like a heartbeat. Inside were all my documents: old deeds, business share certificates, partnership agreements, account guarantees, the very roots of everything I had once built. My son had taken control of the tree, but the roots had always been mine. He laid the papers gently on the table. I stared at them for a long time, the ink faded, but still holding my name with authority. He started explaining the legal process: revoking ownership guarantees, freezing corporate accounts, transferring the remaining property titles. I listened quietly. There was no anger in me now, only clarity. Every word he spoke was a brick being laid on the path toward balance. "It'll take about 3 days to process everything," he said. "After that, your son won't have access to these assets. The business accounts will be frozen until further verification." 3 days. The same number of days it took for him to throw me out. The irony wasn't lost on me. I nodded slowly. "Do it," I said. "All of it." He hesitated. "You understand what this means?" I met his eyes and said, "Yes. It means my son will finally learn the value of what he destroyed." As he began filling out the forms, I thought about the day my son started his company. He was so full of hope, so proud when I stood beside him for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. I remembered the sign above the glass door: Legacy Industries. I smiled bitterly at that memory. The legacy wasn't his, it was mine. Every brick in that office, every desk, every machine, every client connection, all born from my labor, my name, my goodwill. He had forgotten that when he told me to leave his home. The pen felt heavy in my hand as I signed the papers. Each signature felt like closing a door, one on the past, one on betrayal, one on the illusion of love that was never returned. Mr. Raymond watched me carefully, his eyes soft with understanding. When the last page was done, he took my hand and said quietly, "You're doing the right thing. Some lessons can only be taught this way." He packed the papers back into his briefcase, promised to deliver them to the bank and business board that afternoon, and left. I watched him walk away, disappearing down the long path lined with trees. The morning sun broke through the branches, casting light on the wet ground. I took it as a sign, not of revenge, but of release. Back in my room, I sat by the window, the warmth of sunlight falling on my face. For the first time in weeks, my heart didn't ache. The fear of losing everything had already passed. What remained was quiet strength. I thought about my wife, how she would have handled this. She was softer than me, kinder. She would have cried for him. But I wasn't her. I had spent my life forgiving. Now, I would spend what remained reclaiming what was rightfully mine. Later that evening, as I sipped my tea, I imagined him sitting in his office, unaware of what had already begun. The system would move slowly, silently, and then all at once. His accounts would stop working. His investors would panic. His phone would start ringing not with opportunity, but with loss. He had said to me once, "Dad, you wouldn't survive without me." I smiled faintly at the memory, whispering to the empty room, "We'll see." In that quiet moment, I didn't feel like a broken man anymore. I felt like a storm that had waited too long to arrive, patient, silent, unstoppable. The next 3 days felt like a lifetime, slow, deliberate, heavy with quiet power. Each sunrise looked the same through the thin curtains of my care center window. But I knew the world outside was changing. I didn't need to see it. I could feel it. The wheels of justice don't roar. They whisper, and those whispers had already begun. On the morning of the first day, I got a brief call from Mr. Raymond. His voice was calm, but carried a certain weight. "It's done," he said. "The revocations have been submitted. The guarantees are withdrawn." Just those words. Simple, cold, final. I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat still for a long while, letting the silence settle over me like the closing of a chapter. That first day, I imagined my son at his office. He'd be sitting in his chair, checking numbers on his computer like every morning. He'd smile at the steady figures that represented my lifetime of sacrifice. He wouldn't notice right away, not on day one. The banks don't move that fast. But small things would begin to shift. The system would flag his accounts for review, payments would bounce back. Clients would start calling, confused. And somewhere in the middle of it all, he'd call me. He'd expect me to pick up, to calm the storm. But I didn't. I let the phone ring, each vibration reminding me of the heartbeat he once ignored. By the second day, the storm began to hit him for real. Mr. Raymond called again, giving me a quiet update. "The main account is frozen," he said. "Without your guarantee, the investors have pulled out. There's panic." I said nothing for a while, then whispered, "Good." It wasn't joy that I felt. It was justice. Calm, clean, inevitable justice. I didn't want to ruin him. I wanted him to understand that everything he had stood on, every comfort, every success, was built on my shoulders. And when those shoulders finally stepped away, his empire couldn't stand. That evening, while the care home residents were gathered for dinner, I sat alone in my room. The nurse asked if I was feeling all right. I said yes, though my heart was heavy. Not with guilt, but with memory. I thought about the day I signed the original papers for his business, how proud he had been. "You're my hero, Dad," he'd said, tears in his eyes. I believed him. I didn't know that the same lips would later say, "You can't stay here anymore." Love, I realized, is not destroyed by hate. It's destroyed by comfort. When people forget the sacrifices that built their comfort in the first place. On the morning of the third day, I woke before dawn. The care center was quiet, the hallway lights dim. I made myself a small cup of coffee, my hands steady for the first time in weeks. As the steam rose, the phone on my table began to buzz. I didn't need to see the name. I already knew. My son. I let it ring once, twice. Then I picked up. His voice was frantic, shaking. "Dad, something's wrong. The accounts are frozen. The business. The house." His words stumbled over one another, like he was trying to outrun the truth. I said nothing. I just listened to the panic I had once felt in his silence. "Dad, please," he shouted. "They're saying you did this. Tell me it's not true." I took a slow breath. "Everything I built for you," I said quietly. "And everything you destroyed, you did on your own." Then I hung up. By afternoon, Mr. Raymond called again. "It's complete," he said. "The properties are officially transferred." The sale went through faster than expected. My old house, the one my wife and I had built brick by brick, had been sold that morning. The funds were now redirected to a private account under my name, the same name my son had erased from his heart. I thanked him again and sat there, looking out the window as the sun broke through the clouds. 3 days. That's all it took for everything to turn. 3 days after he threw me out, his world collapsed under the weight of his own choices. He thought he could live without the man who made him, but now he would learn that some roots, once cut, can take the whole tree down with them. That night, as I lay back in bed, I didn't feel revenge. I felt peace, deep, still, unshakable peace. The kind that comes not from winning, but from knowing justice no longer needs your hands. It was evening when the storm reached him. Not the kind that comes from the sky, but the kind that comes when a man realizes everything he built was never really his. I was sitting by the window of my small room in the care center, watching the rain slide down the glass, when the door burst open. My son stood there, drenched, trembling, his face pale as if life itself had drained from it. He looked older, smaller, almost unrecognizable from the confident man who once threw me out like a stranger. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair messy, and his voice cracked as soon as he spoke. "Dad, what did you do?" The nurse at the counter peeked over, startled, but I raised my hand gently to tell her it was fine. My son stepped inside, water dripping from his shoes onto the floor. His eyes darted around the small room, from the narrow bed to the plain walls. It must have hit him how low I had fallen, or maybe how far he had pushed me. He clenched his fists, took a shaky breath, and said again, louder this time, "What did you do?" I looked at him quietly. The calm in my chest was steady, unbroken. "Sit," I said, pointing to the chair near my bed. He didn't. He couldn't. He just stood there, shaking, his chest heaving with panic. "The business is gone," he said. "The investors pulled out. The accounts are locked. The house. Dad, the house." He stopped. His lips quivered like he couldn't form the words. I already knew what he was about to say. I had spoken to Mr. Raymond that morning. The papers were finalized. The house, the same one he threw me out of, was sold to a new owner by noon. Legally, cleanly, completely. He had received the notice that afternoon. 3 days. That's all it took for the foundation of his arrogance to crumble into dust. He ran his hands through his hair and laughed weakly, almost hysterical. "You ruined everything. You destroyed my life." His voice cracked on the last word. I looked at him, my heart heavy but calm. "I didn't destroy anything," I said softly. "I just took back what was never yours." He froze, staring at me like he didn't recognize the man speaking. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he thought the old, tired father he had abandoned had died in that hospital bed. He didn't know that betrayal has a way of sharpening a man's soul. He started pacing the room, muttering to himself. "How could you do this? I had plans, deals, a wedding." He stopped mid-sentence. His voice dropped. "Dad, please, I can fix this. I'll make it right." He sank to the edge of the bed, holding his head in his hands. His shoulders shook, and for a moment I almost saw the boy I once carried on those same shoulders, the boy who used to hug me when he was scared of thunder. But the thunder that terrified him now was of his own making. I took a deep breath. "You threw me out 3 days after surgery," I said quietly. "You didn't ask if I was eating. You didn't call. You didn't care. You told me I was a burden." My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. He looked up, eyes red, mouth trembling. "I didn't mean it, Dad." I was tired. I was stressed. I shook my head. "You meant every word." He fell silent. The clock on the wall ticked loudly between us, marking the space that years of love and pride had once filled. Finally, he whispered, "Please, just tell me what to do. I'll fix it. I'll make it right." I leaned forward slowly, my hands clasped together. "You can't fix what you broke," I said. "You can only learn from it." He broke down then, really broke down. His body folded in on itself, sobbing quietly, his tears falling onto the floor like rain. The man who once threw his father into the cold was now standing in the same coldness, except this time there was no door for him to slam shut. I didn't move to comfort him. I just watched. Not out of cruelty, but because I wanted him to sit with what he had done. After a long silence, I spoke again. "You built your life on what I gave you," I said. "And now you'll learn how to build one on what you've earned." He looked up, eyes wide, searching for the father who would forgive him like always. But that father no longer existed. He stood up slowly, wiped his face, and stumbled toward the door. Before leaving, he turned and said, voice shaking, "I have nothing left." I looked at him, truly looked, and said, "Then you finally know how I felt." He left without another word. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the windows like applause for the truth. I sat back down, breathing slowly. For the first time in years, my heart didn't ache. It felt free. The next morning came gray and quiet. The rain had stopped, but the world outside still looked wet, like it had been crying through the night. I sat on the same wooden chair by the window, hands folded on my lap, feeling the calm after the storm. My son came again, this time without the rage. His steps were slower, his shoulders low, his eyes swollen from crying. He didn't knock. He just stood in the doorway for a few seconds, as if asking permission to enter the same space where he had once left me broken. I looked at him and said nothing. Silence was the only language left between us. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, until he was standing right in front of me. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Dad, please." He stopped, unable to continue. His throat tightened around every word. His eyes searched my face, looking for the softness he once knew. But I wasn't the same man he had thrown out 3 days ago. That man was weak, forgiving, blind with love. The one sitting in front of him now had learned what love meant when it was tested, and when it wasn't returned. He dropped to his knees without warning. The sound of it, knees hitting the cold tile, echoed through the small room like thunder. His head hung low, his hands clutched together. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I was stupid. I was angry. I didn't mean to hurt you, I didn't move." I let him cry. Tears ran down his face, dripping onto the floor, mixing with the mud from his shoes. For a moment, I saw flashes of the boy he used to be. The boy who cried when he scraped his knee. The boy who once said he'd buy me a house bigger than any I could build. But that boy was gone. In his place was a man who had only learned love through loss. He kept begging. "Please, Dad, I have nothing left. The company's gone. The house. They locked it. I can't even pay the bills. I don't know what to do." His voice broke again, and his hands shook as he tried to wipe his tears. I watched him crumble in front of me, the same man who once stood tall in front of his friends, bragging about his success, telling them how he built everything from nothing. Now he couldn't even build a sentence without breaking apart. I finally stood up, slowly, carefully. My body still ached from the surgery, but my heart was steady. I walked closer until I was standing right above him. He looked up, eyes red, breath shaking. "I gave you everything," I said softly. "Every dream, every penny, every piece of my strength. And when I had nothing left but myself, you took that away too." He lowered his head again. I could see guilt written all over him, not the kind that fades, but the kind that stays forever. He tried to grab my hand, but I stepped back. "You wanted me gone," I said. "You said you couldn't carry the weight of my life. Now you know what that weight feels like." He started crying again, harder this time, his voice echoing down the hallway. A nurse came to check what was happening, but I raised my hand gently, and she stepped away. This was between a father and a son, the final reckoning that years of love and betrayal had written. He looked up one last time. "Please forgive me," he whispered. "I'll do anything." I didn't answer right away. I thought about forgiveness, what it really means. It doesn't always mean forgetting. Sometimes it means letting someone live with the truth they created. I looked down at him and said, "Forgiveness isn't a word, son. It's a lesson. And you're still learning." He bowed his head again, tears soaking his sleeves. After a few minutes, he stood up slowly, unsteady, like a man who had aged 20 years in 3 days. He looked around the small room once more, at the simple chair, the folded blanket, the half-drunk cup of tea. Maybe he finally understood that peace doesn't come from comfort. It comes from conscience. Before he left, he said quietly, "I don't deserve you." I nodded once. "No," I said. "You deserve the truth." And with that, he turned and walked away, his reflection fading in the glass door. I stood there for a long while, listening to the echo of his footsteps fade into the hall. For the first time in years, I felt something deep inside loosen. Not joy, not triumph, but freedom. My son had finally knelt, not before me, but before the weight of his own choices. And sometimes, that's the only justice a father ever needs. After he left, the room felt bigger, not because of its size, but because the weight inside it had finally shifted. The air no longer felt thick. I sat down on the edge of my bed, looking at the quiet doorway where my son had just stood. The same man who once told me to get out now couldn't even stand tall in front of me. I wasn't proud. I wasn't angry. I was just still. For the first time in years, silence didn't hurt. It healed. The next few days passed quietly. The nurses checked on me more often now. They had seen what happened that morning, the begging, the tears, the fall of a proud man. They didn't ask questions. They just smiled softly, left a little extra sugar in my coffee, and made sure my blanket was tucked properly at night. I had become someone else's father now, not by blood, but by care. Funny how strangers can show more love than family ever did. Meanwhile, the world outside was collapsing for him. I didn't need updates to know it. You can feel it when a man's ego breaks. It echoes through the air. I imagined him sitting in his empty office, lights off, papers scattered, phone ringing with demands he couldn't answer, investors pulling out, banks demanding payment, friends disappearing one by one. The same people who once clapped for his success were now whispering behind his back. That's how the world works. Love follows money, and when the money fades, so does the love. But this wasn't about money anymore. This was about lessons, the kind life doesn't teach with kindness. My son had lived thinking strength came from power, that men like me, quiet, old, patient, were weak. But strength isn't loud, it doesn't shout or threaten. It builds, waits, and when the time comes, it moves mountains with a whisper. That's what he learned when everything he owned vanished within 3 days. I thought a lot about forgiveness during that time. It's strange. People think forgiveness is about letting someone off the hook. But real forgiveness is about letting yourself stop bleeding from wounds they no longer remember. I had spent years trying to forgive him in silence, hoping he'd change, hoping he'd see the man who gave him everything. But forgiveness without understanding is wasted. So I stopped trying to heal him, and healed myself instead. One evening, as the sky turned orange outside the window, I sat in the garden with Mr. Raymond. He had come by to check on me, bring some papers, and share a quiet cup of tea. He told me the legal transfers were final, the funds secured, and my name officially restored to every property. "It's over," he said with a smile. But I shook my head gently. "No," I said. "It's just beginning." He didn't ask what I meant. He knew. It wasn't revenge I was talking about. It was rebirth. A few weeks later, I moved out of the care center and into a small house near the lake, peaceful, bright, with birds singing outside every morning. It wasn't big, but it was mine. Every inch of it carried peace, not pride. Sometimes I'd sit on the porch with my cup of tea and watch families walk by, fathers, sons, laughter. I'd smile, not with sadness, but with understanding. Life has a way of giving second chances, but it rarely gives them twice. My son sent me a letter a month later. No fancy paper, no signature, just a folded note. Inside he wrote, "I'm working again, starting from scratch. Thank you for teaching me what real strength looks like." I held that paper for a long time, staring at those words. Maybe he was finally learning what it meant to build, not with my money, but with his own hands. That night, I slept peacefully, not because everything was perfect, but because everything was fair. Justice, when it arrives quietly, leaves no scars, only clarity. I realized something simple. Life doesn't punish, it teaches. It doesn't shout, it mirrors. My son had learned through loss what I had tried to teach him through love. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The older I get, the more I realize that life is not about how much you build. It's about what remains standing when everything falls apart. I used to think love meant giving endlessly, that a father's role was to provide without question. But now I know love must also have boundaries. A father who never says enough raises a child who never learns gratitude. I learned that lesson too late, but at least I learned it. My son thought he broke me when he kicked me out after my surgery, but he only freed me from an illusion. The illusion that love, without respect, can survive. I live differently now. My mornings start with peace, not noise. I wake to the sound of soft wind moving through the trees, not arguments behind closed doors. My home is small, but every corner holds honesty. No lies, no pride, just quiet truth. Sometimes I make 2 cups of tea out of habit, one for me, one for the memory of a son I once carried on my back through muddy roads to school. I don't drink the second cup. I just let the steam rise and fade, like everything else that once felt permanent. He visits sometimes, not often, but enough. Each time, he comes humbler. He doesn't talk about business or money anymore. He asks about my health, my garden, the little things that used to bore him. I can see the weight of what he lost in his eyes, but I can also see something new: understanding. Maybe pain really is the only teacher strong enough to change a man. The first time he came, he stood awkwardly at the door, unsure if he was welcome. I didn't make it easy. I let him stand there a few seconds longer, just so he could feel what absence feels like. Then I nodded. He smiled faintly. It wasn't a reunion. It was a restart. The world still talks about what happened. Small towns remember things for a long time. They whisper about the man whose son lost everything in 3 days, about how karma sometimes wears a father's face. But I don't listen to gossip. People see the fall, but not the years that led to it. The nights I stayed awake counting the bills for his dreams, the sacrifices that went unnoticed, the respect that slowly turned into entitlement. No one sees the quiet humiliation that builds behind closed doors. I stopped trying to explain myself long ago. Now I spend my evenings on the porch, watching the sunset spill gold across the water. The sky reminds me that even endings can look beautiful when you accept them. I think about my wife sometimes. She would have been proud of how calm I've become. She always told me, "Don't raise your voice. Raise your worth." I finally understand what she meant. I didn't need to shout at my son. I just had to step back and let the truth speak for itself. He lost everything he thought he owned. I lost everything I thought I needed. But somehow, we both found something better: clarity. He learned that money without morals is hollow. I learned that love without boundaries is dangerous. And though our paths diverged painfully, I know that both of us are walking toward something more honest now. When people ask if I forgave him, I say yes. But not in the way they think. Forgiveness isn't about erasing the past. It's about not letting it poison the present. I forgave him because I didn't want to carry bitterness into the years I have left. Bitterness is heavy, and I've carried enough weight in this life already. Sometimes I wonder if he will ever forgive himself. Maybe he will. Maybe he won't. But that's his journey now. Mine is over. I've done my part. As a father, as a man, as someone who gave everything and finally learned to take back peace. He kicked me out after my surgery, thinking I would fade quietly. But life has a strange balance. 3 days later, he watched his world crumble in the same silence he once left me in. Final thought. He thought I was weak because I didn't fight back. But strength isn't in shouting, it's in waiting. I waited, and the world taught him everything I no longer needed to say.